The Hells Angels biker heard the little girl whisper, "He's coming back," and his next strike ended a predator's reign. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. It was a cold, crisp night in the small town of Maple Ridge. The moon hung high in the sky, casting a soft glow on the empty streets below. The only sound was the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind, the town seemingly lost in its peaceful slumber. But in the shadows, something dark stirred. Marcus Steele Thompson, a Hells Angels biker known for his cold demeanor and fearsome reputation, cruised down the winding road leading into town. His motorcycle roared beneath him, the engine's deep growl reverberating through the night air. He had just returned from a meeting with his brothers in a neighboring town, and as always, his mind raced with thoughts of the club, of loyalty, and the unspoken rules that governed his life. But tonight, something was different. As he neared the outskirts of Maple Ridge, his headlights caught something unexpected, a small figure stumbling in the middle of the road. His hand instinctively gripped the throttle harder, his bike speeding up as he tried to assess the situation. As he got closer, he saw her, a young girl, no more than 10, her face pale with fear, her eyes wide with desperation. She was standing in the middle of the road, barely able to stand on her own. Without a second thought, Steele slammed the brakes, his bike screeching to a halt just inches from her. The girl flinched, but didn't move, as if frozen in place by the overwhelming fear that gripped her. Steele's heart skipped a beat as he dismounted, his boots hitting the pavement with a heavy thud. He took a cautious step toward the girl, his voice rough from years of shouting over the roar of motorcycles. "Hey kid, are you alright?" The girl didn't speak at first. She just stared at him, her chest heaving with shallow breaths, as if she were too scared to say anything. Steele took another step closer, his instincts kicking in. Something was terribly wrong. "Come on, kid," he said, his voice softening just a fraction. "What's going on? Where's your family?" The girl's eyes darted nervously around the street, as if expecting someone, or something, to appear from the shadows. Finally, she whispered, so quietly that Steele almost didn't hear her. "He's coming back." Steele's mind raced as he tried to make sense of her words. "Who's coming back?" he asked, his tone more urgent now. The girl's trembling lips parted, and she managed to get out just 2 words. "The monster." At that moment, something inside Steele shifted. The protective instincts that had long been buried under layers of hardened steel began to surface. He knew this wasn't just a random encounter. This girl, alone and terrified in the middle of nowhere, was in danger. He knelt down to her level, his voice calm but firm. "Listen to me. You're safe now. I won't let anyone hurt you." The girl's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded, her small body shaking. Steele reached out and gently touched her shoulder. "Where do you live? Let me take you home." But before the girl could answer, a distant sound reached their ears, the unmistakable screech of tires, followed by the roar of an engine. Steele's head snapped up, his muscles tensing. "He's coming," the girl whispered again, her voice breaking. Steele's gaze hardened. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. This wasn't just some random predator. This was personal. Without wasting another moment, Steele stood up, his protective instincts kicking into overdrive. He knew what he had to do. The monster wouldn't be hurting anyone tonight. Steele's eyes narrowed as the headlights of a car appeared in the distance. His hand went to the handle of his motorcycle, and with a deep breath, he prepared for what was coming. The predator would learn, in the hardest way possible, that when you mess with the innocent, you mess with a Hell's Angel. As Steele stood, his boots planted firmly on the cold pavement, the distant roar of an engine grew louder. His heart thudded in his chest, and his senses sharpened. He could feel the tension building, the realization sinking in that this wasn't just a random encounter. It was something much more dangerous. The girl beside him trembled, her face pale, her wide eyes filled with fear as she stared toward the approaching vehicle. Steele's mind raced. The predator was close. He could feel it in his gut. "Stay close," he muttered to the girl, his voice low and protective. Without looking away from the road, he reached down, ensuring the handle of his motorcycle was within easy reach. The bike was his companion, his strength, and tonight, it would be his weapon. The car's headlights cut through the darkness, gleaming like an ominous predator creeping closer. Steele's muscles coiled, ready to act. He could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand up as the car slowed, its tires crunching over the gravel as it came to a halt just a few feet away from him and the girl. The door creaked open, and out stepped a man, tall, with a sinister aura that immediately sent a chill down Steele's spine. His face was obscured by a black cap, but the way he moved, the cocky swagger of someone who thought he owned the night, made Steele's blood boil. Well, the man said, his voice oozing with confidence. What do we have here? A lost little girl and a Hell's Angel in the middle of nowhere. The man's grin stretched wide, revealing crooked teeth. Steele's jaw tightened as he stepped forward, positioning himself between the girl and the man. You're not welcome here, Steele growled, his voice like gravel. The man smirked, unfazed. I don't take orders from bikers, he said, his eyes flicking over Steele's leather jacket and the Hell's Angel's patch on his back. But I suppose you're here to stop me, huh? I doubt you're going to do much. Steele's heart rate picked up. This wasn't the first time he'd faced off with someone who underestimated him. He'd spent years earning his reputation, and he wasn't about to let this man, or anyone, tear down the walls of his world. You're not going anywhere, Steele said firmly, his voice low but filled with a promise. The man took a step closer, his eyes scanning Steele's frame, sizing him up. You think you can stop me? I've done worse to people than you'll ever know. This girl is just a pawn, a means to an end. Steele's eyes narrowed. Not anymore. With a swift motion, he reached for the knife hidden beneath his jacket. The man didn't flinch, but his posture shifted slightly. He was getting ready to make a move. Steele's mind raced, but everything seemed to slow as the man lunged. In a flash, Steele reacted, his years of training kicking in. He sidestepped the man's attack and grabbed his wrist, twisting it with enough force to make the man drop the knife. A look of surprise flashed across the man's face before it contorted with rage. You bastard, he spat, trying to break free. Steele didn't hesitate. With one swift movement, he drove his knee into the man's stomach, sending him crashing to the ground. Stay down, Steele warned, standing over him. The man groaned, but didn't try to get up. Steele's eyes flicked back to the girl. She stood frozen, her wide eyes locked on the scene before her. Steele took a deep breath, trying to steady his racing heart. It's over, he said, turning back to the man on the ground. You're done. You'll never hurt anyone again. But just as he turned to walk away, he heard the sound of approaching footsteps, more than one set. Steele's instincts kicked in, and he glanced around quickly, his mind calculating. He wasn't alone anymore. The girl's whisper echoed in his mind. He's coming back. Steele's heart sank as he realized the situation was far from over. He wasn't just facing one predator, there were more, and they were closing in fast. With the girl still in his thoughts, he knew there was no turning back. He would have to protect her, no matter the cost. The sound of motorcycles revving in the distance broke through the tension, and Steele's jaw clenched. This was the beginning of something far more dangerous than he could have imagined. As Steele stood over the man on the ground, he heard the sound of heavy boots pounding against the gravel. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He wasn't alone anymore. He was about to face the full force of this predator's pack. Steele quickly assessed the situation. The man on the ground was groaning, his hands still clutching his stomach, but he wasn't a threat anymore. The new voices grew louder, and Steele turned to see 3 more men emerging from the shadows. Their eyes locked onto him immediately, their faces twisted in contempt. These weren't ordinary criminals. These were hunters, the kind of men who took pride in their reputation, who had no qualms about doing whatever it took to get what they wanted. Steele's jaw clenched. He wasn't afraid, but he wasn't going to underestimate them, either. He looked over at the girl, still standing frozen at the side of the road. Stay behind me, he told her firmly, his voice low and commanding. The girl nodded, her eyes wide with fear, but she took a small step back, hiding behind Steele. The man who had been on the ground was slowly rising to his feet, his face now dark with rage. You'll pay for that, you son of a bitch, he spat, his voice venomous. Steele didn't respond. He didn't need to. His eyes locked on the approaching men, his mind calculating his next move. The first one to approach was a big guy, wearing a leather jacket with the same insignia Steele had seen on the man he had just taken down. He was their leader, the Alpha. He was also the biggest threat. Steele could see it in the way he moved. Every step was deliberate, his posture one of arrogance. "You made a mistake," the man growled, his eyes narrowing as he studied Steele. "You shouldn't have interfered." Steele's heart rate didn't increase. If anything, it slowed. He was calm, focused. He had been in situations like this before. He knew how to handle threats. "Get out of here," Steele said quietly, his voice steady. "Before things get worse for you." The man didn't seem to take the warning seriously. He smirked, his hand reaching for the knife at his belt. "You don't tell me what to do, biker." With a swift movement, Steele grabbed the man's arm, twisting it with a sudden force that sent the knife flying from his grip. The man let out a grunt of pain, but before he could retaliate, Steele landed a solid punch to his face, sending him sprawling to the ground. The other two men hesitated for a brief moment, shocked by how quickly Steele had neutralized their leader. Steele didn't give them time to think. He moved like a flash, his training kicking in. One of the men lunged toward him, but Steele ducked, grabbing the man's arm and flipping him over his shoulder. He heard a loud thud as the man hit the ground. Hard, the air knocked out of him. The third man, smaller and faster, darted toward Steele with a baseball bat raised. Steele sidestepped at the last second, grabbing the bat mid-swing and twisting it out of the man's hands. With one swift motion, he disarmed him and delivered a punch that sent the man to his knees. Steele stood tall, breathing deeply, his chest rising and falling as the adrenaline surged through him. He looked around at the men on the ground, groaning in pain, their bodies sprawled out in defeat. "You should have stayed away," Steele muttered under his breath. He turned his attention back to the girl, who was still hiding behind him. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, his voice full of concern. The girl nodded, her eyes wide but filled with a sense of relief. "Thank you," she whispered. Steele nodded, his gaze softening as he gave her a reassuring smile. "You're safe now." Just as he began to relax, the sound of sirens grew louder. Steele tensed, his body ready for anything. He didn't need the cops showing up right now, not with the mess he'd just made. But before he could make a decision, he saw the flashing red and blue lights pull into the parking lot. The girl's eyes darted nervously at the approaching police car. "They're going to want answers," she said, her voice trembling. Steele nodded, his expression serious. "I know. But right now, the most important thing is that you're safe." The police car stopped a few feet away, and the officers stepped out, their eyes scanning the scene. They saw the men on the ground, groaning and clutching their injuries. The leader was still struggling to get to his feet, blood trickling down his face. The officer in charge, a tall woman with short blonde hair, immediately recognized Steele. "Steele," she said with a raised eyebrow. "What the hell happened here?" Steele stood tall, his posture exuding calm authority. "These men attacked us," he said simply. "I had to defend myself and the girl." The woman looked over at the girl, who was still standing behind Steele, her face pale but determined. "Is she all right?" she asked, her voice softening. Steele nodded. "She's fine. But these guys were after her. I couldn't let them hurt her." The officer looked back at the men on the ground, her expression hardening. "We'll take it from here," she said. "You did good, Steele. But next time, try not to make a mess that big." Steele gave her a curt nod. "I'll keep that in mind." As the officers moved in to arrest the men, Steele turned to the girl. "You're safe now," he repeated, his voice steady and reassuring. But inside, he knew this was far from over. The predator was still out there, and it wouldn't be long before Steele had to face him again. The night air in Maple Ridge felt heavier now, thicker with tension. The events of the past few hours had unfolded too quickly, too dangerously, and Steele knew he couldn't relax just yet. He stood by the side of his motorcycle, watching as the police officers escorted the men into their squad cars. His eyes were focused, never straying too far from the girl, who was now sitting on the curb, still clutching the blanket Steele had given her. Her small frame shivered under the weight of the cold night, but there was a new look in her eyes, one of quiet gratitude. Steele had seen that look before, in the eyes of those he'd helped in the past, but it had never felt like this. He wasn't just a protector to her. He was the barrier between her and something far darker. The police officers finished their work and began to drive away, the flash of their red and blue lights fading in the distance. Steele could feel the weight of the moment settle on his shoulders. The danger wasn't over. Not by a long shot. He turned to the girl, whose eyes were still fixed on the empty road. "You okay?" he asked, his voice soft but steady. She nodded, though her gaze seemed distant, haunted. Steele's heart tightened. He knew that look. It was the look of someone who had seen something they weren't meant to see. Something that would stay with them forever. He walked over to her, crouching down to her level. "What happened, kid?" he asked gently. The girl's lips trembled, but she said nothing at first. Steele waited, giving her the time she needed. Finally, she whispered, her voice barely audible. He's not the first one. He's part of a group of bad people." Steele's gut twisted. The more she spoke, the clearer it became that this wasn't just a random attack. This was something much bigger, something more coordinated. "What do you mean?" he pressed softly. "They hurt people. Bad people, people who are weak. They've been doing this for a long time." Her words hung in the air like a warning. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice cracking. "I didn't want to get you involved." Steele placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, trying to steady her. "Hey, don't apologize. You did the right thing." She looked up at him, her eyes brimming with tears. "But they'll come after me. After us." Steele felt a cold shiver run down his spine. He had known from the moment the man had spoken to him that this wasn't over. The group the girl was talking about, they were not finished. They would keep coming until they got what they wanted. Steele straightened up and turned toward his bike. "Stay here. I'll handle it," he said, his voice firm. The girl looked at him, her face filled with fear and confusion. "You'll be safe. I promise." Steele mounted his motorcycle and revved the engine, the roar of it breaking the silence of the night. As he sped down the empty street, his mind raced. Who were these people? What did they want with the girl? And why had they been so determined to track her down? The answers were unclear, but one thing was certain. They weren't going to stop. Not unless he made them. Steele felt the familiar weight of his Hell's Angels patch on his back, a symbol of both pride and responsibility. It had always been about loyalty, about protecting the ones who couldn't protect themselves. He would not let this group of predators harm anyone else. He would end this, once and for all. He took a sharp turn onto a narrow, dark street, his eyes scanning the area for any sign of trouble. It was then that he saw it, a figure standing in the shadows, just outside a dilapidated building. Steele's instincts kicked in immediately. He didn't need to ask questions. He knew the moment he saw the figure that this was no ordinary man. This was one of them. The girl's words echoed in his mind. They've been doing this for a long time. Steele slowed his bike, his hand instinctively reaching for the knife hidden beneath his jacket. The man in the shadows didn't move, but Steele could feel the tension thickening in the air. This was the moment. The predator would strike first if Steele didn't act. With a quick motion, Steele dismounted his bike, his boots hitting the ground with a heavy thud. He moved silently, his body poised and ready. The man in the shadows watched him intently, his posture betraying nothing. "I know who you are," Steele said, his voice cold. "And I know what you're here for." The man chuckled, a low, sinister sound. "You think you can stop us?" he sneered. "You and your little club of misfits." Steele didn't flinch. "You've made a mistake. Coming after this girl is your last one." The man's eyes narrowed, and before Steele could react, he lunged forward, swinging a blade with deadly precision. Steele was ready. He sidestepped the attack, his movements fluid, trained. The man stumbled forward, off balance, and Steele took advantage of the opening. He grabbed the man by the wrist, twisting it with a sharp motion. The blade fell to the ground with a clatter. "I don't want to hurt you," Steele said calmly, but his voice carried a warning. "Leave now, or things will get worse for you." The man's face twisted with anger, but Steele could see the fear flickering in his eyes. He was outmatched. Steele's grip tightened, and he shoved the man back. The man stumbled, his back hitting the side of the building. "This is your last warning," Steele said, stepping forward. "Get out of my town." The man hesitated, then slowly backed away, his eyes never leaving Steele. "You'll regret this," he hissed. "We'll be back." Steele watched as the man disappeared into the darkness, his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't sure if the words were a threat or a promise, but one thing was clear. This battle was far from over. The night had fallen quieter after the confrontation. Steele stood outside the rundown building, his hands still tense from the fight. His eyes scanned the area, but there was no sign of the man he'd just dealt with, no signs of movement. Yet, The weight of what had just happened pressed heavily on his chest. He could still hear the words of the girl echoing in his mind. They've been doing this for a long time. His eyes narrowed as he thought about that group. The one that had been tracking the girl and leaving destruction in their wake. They had their claws in deep, and Steele knew it wouldn't end until they were stopped. The cold wind of the night bit at his skin, but the chill was nothing compared to the unease that gnawed at him. The girl was safe, for now, but it wasn't over. He needed answers, needed to find out who these people were and how far their reach went. With a heavy sigh, Steele turned and walked back to his bike. He revved the engine, the deep rumble echoing through the empty streets of Maple Ridge. As he made his way toward his garage, his mind was already planning. The first step was finding out everything he could about this group. They wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted, and that meant he had to be ready for them. Steele had never been a man to shy away from danger. His years in the Hells Angels had taught him to fight, to protect, and to never back down. But this wasn't just about the girl anymore. This was personal. As he pulled into the garage, Steele parked his bike and dismounted. He looked up at the building. It was small, worn down by years of use and abuse, but it was his safe haven. It had been the place he had come to after leaving the club for good, the place where he could think, plan, and regroup. Steele walked into the garage and flicked on the lights. The empty space seemed to stretch before him, cold and sterile. He hadn't been back here long, and he still wasn't sure what to do with it all. But tonight, it would be the base of his operations. He walked over to the workbench and began rifling through some old papers, searching for any clue that could help him. As his hands moved over the worn-out documents, his mind kept drifting back to the girl. The look in her eyes, the fear that had gripped her when she spoke about the group that had been hunting her. He couldn't help but wonder how long they had been watching her. Had she been a target for months, or was this something new? He didn't know, but what he did know was that he couldn't let them get away with it. Not while she was still out there. Steele picked up a phone, dialing a number he hadn't used in years. The line rang for a few moments before it was answered. Yeah. The voice on the other end was rough, familiar, and unyielding. I need information, Steele said, his voice calm but commanding. About a group of people. They're dangerous. They've been targeting a girl. The voice on the other end was quiet for a moment. You sure about this? It asked. Steele's grip on the phone tightened. I'm sure. There was another pause before the voice spoke again, this time with more urgency. All right. I'll see what I can find, but you know this isn't going to be easy. These people, they're not the kind you want to mess with. Steele's jaw tightened. I don't have a choice. After hanging up, he paced around the garage, his mind running through every possibility. The group had to be connected to something larger, something that went beyond the girl. He had to know what they were after, but it wasn't just about finding answers. It was about protecting the innocent, about making sure that no one else fell victim to whatever dark plans they had in store. The sound of a motorcycle engine broke his train of thought. It wasn't his bike. Steele froze, his senses immediately on high alert. He reached for his gun, but as he looked through the small window of the garage, he saw who it was. A familiar face, one he hadn't seen in years. It was one of his old brothers from the club, a guy named Big Mike. Steele relaxed, lowering his gun, but his eyes never left the figure approaching the door. Big Mike was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a tough exterior, but Steele knew him well enough to know when he was up to something. The door creaked open, and Big Mike stepped inside, his boots making a loud thud as they hit the concrete floor. Steele, Big Mike said with a nod. Heard you might need some help. Steele crossed his arms, looking him over. What kind of help? Big Mike gave him a knowing look. I've been keeping an ear to the ground. I know what's going on. These people you're after, they're part of something bigger. They're connected to a network of criminals. This isn't just about a girl anymore. It's about power, control, and making sure nobody stands in their way. Steele felt his blood run cold. He had known it all along. This wasn't some random group of thugs. They had a plan, and it was bigger than anyone realized. What do we do? Steele asked, his voice steady, though his mind was racing. Big Mike took a step forward. We take them down. All of them. But we need more than just you and me. We need the whole club. Steele's eyes narrowed. You're sure about this? Big Mike nodded. They've been on the rise for years. But they've finally made a mistake. They came after the wrong people. And now, they're going to pay. Steele knew that Big Mike was right. This was just the beginning. The war was coming, and Steele would be ready for it. He would protect the girl. He would take down the people who thought they could get away with everything. And he would do whatever it took to make sure they never hurt anyone again. The night was far from over, but Steele could already feel the weight of what was coming. After Big Mike's warning, the reality of the situation hit him harder than he expected. He had been trained for violence, for battle, but this was something deeper, something more personal. It wasn't just about protecting the girl anymore. It was about wiping out a network that had infiltrated his town and was poised to hurt more people. And he was going to stop them. No one, not even the Hells Angels, had ever seen a fight like the one Steele was preparing for. As he sat in his small office, the harsh light from the overhead bulb flickering above him, he couldn't help but think about the girl, her pale face, her voice trembling as she spoke about the people who'd been hunting her. He had to find out who they were, what they wanted, and most importantly, how far their reach went. Big Mike's words echoed in his mind. They're part of something bigger. This isn't just about a girl anymore. Steele leaned back in his chair, his eyes scanning the room. His motorcycle sat by the wall, a familiar and constant presence. The garage was his sanctuary, the place where everything had started, and now it would be the base of operations for something far more dangerous. Steele's phone buzzed, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was a text from Big Mike. "We need backup. You in?" Steele didn't waste time responding. He typed back one word. "Always." Steele knew he couldn't do this alone. He needed the brothers, the ones who would fight by his side, the ones who understood the meaning of loyalty. Big Mike was already making calls, gathering the men. It was only a matter of time before the rest of the club showed up. The sound of motorcycles revving in the distance told Steele that the first wave of backup had arrived. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the dark street. A familiar silhouette appeared in the parking lot. One of the brothers, pulling up on his bike. Steele stepped outside to greet him. "You ready for this?" Steele asked. The man, a solid member of the club named Dax, grinned. "Born ready." Steele nodded, his expression serious. "We're not just facing random thugs. These people, they're organized. They've been working for too long, and they won't stop unless we stop them." Dax's grin faded slightly. "You're right. We'll handle it, though." Steele gave him a firm look. "I'm not taking any chances. We need to end this. Fast." The plan was simple but dangerous. Steele and the brothers would hit them from all sides, striking when they least expected it. The goal wasn't just to take down a few men. It was to dismantle the entire operation. They had to destroy the group from the inside out, take down their network, and make sure they could never harm anyone again. The first target was the Safe House, a small building on the outskirts of town that the group used as a base of operations. Steele had learned about it through his connections, and now it was time to act. As the brothers gathered in the garage, Steele could feel the adrenaline building in his veins. Each man was armed, ready for a fight, but it wasn't just about the weapons. It was about the unity, the bond they shared. Steele looked around the room, meeting each man's eyes. "This isn't just a job," Steele said, his voice low. "This is about protecting our town. About protecting those who can't protect themselves." They all nodded in agreement. There was no hesitation, no doubt. The Hells Angels were a family, and nothing was going to stand in their way. The plan was set. The men mounted their bikes, the sound of their engines roaring to life as they sped down the darkened streets. Steele led the way, his eyes focused ahead. The time for talk was over. They were about to make their move. As they neared the Safe House, Steele's mind raced. He could already picture what would happen, how they would storm the place, how they would take down the enemy without mercy. But then, just as they were about to make their move, something unexpected happened. The girl, the one Steele had sworn to protect, appeared out of nowhere. She stood in the middle of the road, her small figure barely visible in the headlights of the approaching bikes. Steele slammed on the brakes, his heart leaping into his throat. What the hell is she doing here? Dax yelled over the sound of the engine. Steele's mind raced. What was she thinking? "Get her out of here," Steele ordered, his voice sharp. Dax pulled up alongside her, and Steele saw the fear in the girl's eyes. "I had to come," she said, her voice trembling. "I had to warn you. They're ready for you." Steele's chest tightened. "You need to go home," he said firmly. "It's too dangerous." But the girl shook her head, her face set with determination. "No, you don't understand. They've got someone else. Someone you don't expect. They'll come for you soon." Steele's mind raced. He didn't have time for this. The plan was already in motion, and he couldn't afford distractions. But he also couldn't ignore her warning. Who are they sending? Steele demanded. The girl swallowed hard. Someone from your past, she whispered. Steele froze. Someone from my past. The words hit him like a ton of bricks. His past wasn't something he liked to revisit, but now it seemed that the very thing he had tried to leave behind had come back to haunt him. Steele's thoughts began to spiral. He had no choice but to trust the girl's warning. They couldn't let this go any longer. The stakes were higher than ever, and the clock was ticking. The game had changed. They were no longer just fighting for survival. Now, it was personal. The girl's words hit Steele like a wave crashing against a cliff. Someone from his past was coming for him. The very last thing he expected. His mind reeled as he tried to piece together what she was saying. He didn't have time to ask more questions. Every second counted. The girl's warning seemed to cut through the air, loud and clear. Whoever was coming wasn't just a threat. They were connected to him, to things he thought he had buried. Steele clenched his jaw. We need to move, now, he said, his voice calm, but his eyes were filled with urgency. The brothers, who had been ready for a full assault, now had to rethink everything. Steele's heart raced, not just for the girl's safety, but because his own past had somehow caught up to him. He wasn't sure who they were sending after him, but he could feel it. It wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to be simple. The girl, standing firm in the road, still looked unsettled but resolute. She could see the change in Steele. She had warned him, but there was nothing she could do now except stand by him. Steele didn't want her involved anymore, but the damage was already done. She knew too much. She was part of this now. Get on the bike, Steele ordered, motioning to the girl. She hesitated for only a moment before nodding and walking toward him. Steele helped her onto the back of his motorcycle. She was smaller than most, but he could feel the weight of her fear. It didn't matter now. They had to leave, and they had to leave fast. He revved the engine, the familiar sound filling the cold night air, and they took off, heading toward the outskirts of town. The streets blurred by as Steele pushed the bike harder. He had to get them somewhere safe, but his mind was still on what the girl had said. Someone from your past. Who? The question burned in his mind. As they rode through the darkened streets, Steele's focus never wavered from the road ahead. They passed the familiar landmarks of the town, but none of it felt familiar anymore. Every corner, every alley now held the weight of a new threat. The past was creeping back into his present, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Steele wasn't sure where they were going, but he needed to regroup. His first thought was the old cabin out in the woods, far enough from the city that it was hidden, but not so far that they couldn't make it if they needed to. They wouldn't be safe anywhere else. As they neared the cabin, Steele's grip tightened on the handlebars. The girl's hand was gripping him tightly, her fingers digging into his jacket, but he could tell she was trying to stay calm. She was tougher than she looked, but this wasn't just a game anymore. It was real. The cabin came into view, standing alone in the woods, just as it had for years. The air around it felt heavy, as if the place itself had been waiting for them. Steele pulled the bike up to the cabin and quickly dismounted, helping the girl off the back. They were still a few miles away from the town, but it felt like miles further when it was just the two of them out here. The cabin was a safe house of sorts, a place where Steele had gone to escape the noise of the club, to clear his head. But tonight, it felt like a prison. He motioned for the girl to stay close as he moved to the front door, his eyes scanning the surrounding woods. Something didn't feel right. He couldn't put his finger on it, but his gut was telling him they weren't alone. The silence of the woods made it worse. Steele opened the door, the old hinges creaking under his weight. He glanced back at the girl, who had already stepped inside, her eyes wide with a mix of curiosity and fear. He shut the door behind them and locked it, taking a moment to let his senses adjust. The cabin was simple, old wooden floors, a small fireplace, a few chairs, and a table. It felt like a relic from another time, a life Steele had left behind. But now, it was the only place they could hide. As Steele moved to the window to check the area again, he felt the weight of his past press on him. The girl hadn't said much, but he could feel her watching him, waiting for him to make a move. We'll be safe here for a while, Steele said, though his voice didn't sound as certain as he wanted it to. You should rest. I'll keep watch. The girl nodded, but her face was still etched with worry. She didn't trust this place as much as he did, and he could see it in her eyes. What happens now? She asked quietly, her voice breaking the silence. Steele paused, his hand resting on the windowsill. "We fight back," he said, his tone grim. "We take them down, one by one, and we make sure they never come back." The girl looked up at him, her eyes searching his face, as if she was trying to read the man behind the hardened exterior. Steele's resolve was unshakable, but there was a deep, hidden fear in him that he had never let anyone see. What if this fight was different? What if he wasn't ready for whatever was coming next? His past had a way of catching up to him, and this time, it wasn't just about the Hells Angels. This was personal. He was up against people who knew him, who knew what he was capable of, and they were going to make sure he didn't get in their way. But there was no turning back now. Steele wasn't about to let anyone threaten the girl or anyone else on his watch. The past had finally caught up to him, and he would make sure it would never haunt him again. The night stretched on, silence enveloping the cabin like a heavy blanket. Steele stood by the window, his eyes scanning the darkened woods outside, his thoughts tangled in the web of uncertainty that had been growing since the girl had arrived. He had hoped for a brief respite, a moment of peace before the storm, but it seemed that peace would never come. The danger had already arrived. As he stood there, watching the shadows, he heard the soft sound of footsteps behind him. The girl had moved closer, her presence a reminder that she was still there, still part of this fight. He turned to face her, his face a mask of determination. She was standing in the doorway, her small frame barely visible in the dim light. Her eyes were tired, filled with the same uncertainty that had been growing in his chest. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice quiet but strong. Steele took a deep breath, pushing his thoughts aside for a moment. He couldn't afford to be distracted, not now. Not with everything at stake. "Now we wait," he said, his voice steady. "We wait for them to make their move." The girl frowned, her brow furrowing with concern. "And then?" Steele's gaze hardened. "Then, we take them down." He could feel the weight of the words as they left his mouth. This was the moment he had been preparing for, the moment when everything would either fall apart or come together. He couldn't afford to fail. Not now, not when so many people's lives were on the line. He turned back to the window, his mind racing with the plan they had formed. It wasn't perfect, but it was the best they had. They would have to act quickly, decisively. There would be no room for mistakes. The girl had warned him about the people who were coming, the ones who knew him from his past. It was clear now that this wasn't just about protecting her. It was about confronting the ghosts of his past and making sure they didn't destroy the future. As the minutes passed, Steele could feel the tension building in the air. Every noise outside seemed amplified, every movement a potential threat. His instincts were on edge, his mind always calculating, always ready for the next move. He could feel the weight of the girl's gaze on him, but he didn't turn to face her. He couldn't afford to show any weakness. "You should get some rest," he said, his voice softening slightly. "We don't know when they'll strike, but when they do, it's going to be fast. I need you to be ready." She didn't argue, but Steele could see the hesitation in her eyes. She was scared, and who could blame her? But she had also proven she was stronger than she looked. He admired her for that. As she moved to the couch in the corner of the room, Steele continued to stand by the window, his mind still racing. There was no way to predict when the next move would come, but Steele was prepared. The night dragged on, the silence now more oppressive than before. Steele's thoughts drifted back to the girl's warning, "Someone from your past." He had no idea who it could be, but he knew that whatever was coming, it would be dangerous. The past had a way of catching up with people, and it seemed that his was about to collide with the present in the most violent way possible. As the hours passed, the stillness of the cabin became almost suffocating. Steele couldn't sleep, not with everything hanging in the balance. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the faces of the men he had fought, the ghosts of his past that he thought he had buried. He could feel their presence, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. But this time, he wasn't going to run. He had made that decision the moment he had stepped into the fight. He wasn't going to let the past dictate his future. The sound of a car engine broke the silence, faint at first, but growing louder. Steele's heart skipped a beat. He could feel it in his bones. The time had come. He turned toward the door, his hand instinctively reaching for the gun holstered at his side. He had been ready for this moment, but that didn't mean he was prepared for what was coming. The girl stirred on the couch, sensing the shift in the air. "What's happening?" she asked, her voice trembling with fear. Steele didn't answer right away. Instead, he moved toward the door, his steps silent on the wooden floor. The engine noise grew louder, and then, there it was, just outside the cabin. Steele's hand tightened around the door handle. He opened the door slowly, his eyes scanning the darkness outside. The headlights of a car illuminated the trees in the distance, but there was no movement. Not yet. Get ready, Steele said quietly to the girl, his voice calm despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. This is it. Stay close to me. She nodded, her face pale but determined. Steele could see the fear in her eyes, but there was something else too, a spark of bravery, a will to fight. He knew that whatever was coming, they would face it together. He stepped outside, his boots crunching on the gravel as he made his way toward the trees. The car's headlights flickered, casting long shadows across the ground. Steele could hear the engine rev, the sound of tires skidding on the dirt. They were coming. Steele's grip on his gun tightened. This wasn't just a fight for survival anymore. It was a fight for redemption, for justice, for everything he had left. And he would make sure that no one would ever threaten the girl again. The sound of the engine grew louder, and Steele could feel the tension in the air thicken. He was standing at the edge of the woods, the girl close behind him, her breath quick and shallow as she clutched her coat tightly. Steele's eyes scanned the darkness, trying to make out any movement, every instinct on high alert. His mind raced with possibilities. Who was in that car? Was it just the people who had been hunting her, or was there something more to it? He couldn't afford to make any mistakes now. The girl had already warned him, someone from your past, and Steele's thoughts spiraled back to the words she had spoken in the cabin. Who could it be? It wasn't just the enemy closing in anymore. It was his past catching up with him. As the headlights flickered and grew brighter, Steele's grip tightened on the gun at his side. He took a deep breath, steadying himself for what was to come. The car slowed, its engine purring softly before coming to a stop just a few yards away. The headlights cast long shadows across the trees, and Steele felt every muscle in his body tense, waiting for the inevitable. There was no turning back now. The door to the car opened slowly, and a figure stepped out. It was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, with a face Steele instantly recognized, though it had been years since he had seen it. The man's cold, calculating eyes locked onto Steele. "Steele," the man said, his voice low but carrying a sharp edge. "Did you really think you could outrun your past?" Steele's heart skipped a beat, his blood turning cold. The man standing before him was a ghost from his old life, a member of the same group that had once helped shape Steele into the man he was. The man's name was Victor, and he had been a part of the dark side of Steele's past, a side he had long since tried to forget. Steele took a step forward, his jaw tightening. "Victor," he said, his voice steady despite the rush of memories flooding his mind. "I didn't think I'd ever see you again." Victor chuckled, his grin sharp and menacing. "You've been hiding for a long time. But you can't hide forever, Steele. Not from me, not from us." Steele's hand rested on the gun at his side, but he didn't draw it just yet. There was too much at stake, too much to consider. The girl, still standing behind him, didn't understand the weight of what was happening, but Steele could feel the danger in the air, the way it pressed in on all sides. "What do you want?" Steele asked, his voice cold and hard. "You came all this way for a confrontation?" Victor's grin widened. "I came for more than just a confrontation," he said, stepping closer. "I came for what's mine. And that girl," he gestured toward the girl, who was now visibly shaking, "she's the key." Steele's heart pounded in his chest. The girl had known something was coming. She had known that these people wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted. And now, Steele realized, he was standing in the middle of the storm he had tried so hard to avoid. The air was thick with tension, and Steele's mind raced as he calculated his next move. He couldn't let Victor have what he wanted. He couldn't let his past, his mistakes, define who he was now. But that didn't mean he could do this alone. "You're not getting her," Steele said firmly, his voice unwavering. "I won't let you." Victor's eyes narrowed, his grin fading as he stepped closer, his voice low and threatening. "You think you can stop me? You think you can stop us? We're just getting started, Steele. You don't even know what you're up against." Steele's gaze never wavered, but inside, the doubt began to creep in. He had spent years running from this moment, but here it was. The past was no longer something he could bury. It was in front of him, and he had to face it. He couldn't back down now. "Whatever you're planning," Steele said, It ends tonight. You're not taking anyone from here. Victor laughed, a dark and hollow sound. You're in no position to make demands, Steele. The girl's already caught up in this, whether she likes it or not. Steele's blood ran cold. He glanced over his shoulder at the girl, who was still standing a few feet away, her wide eyes locked onto the two men. She had been pulled into this mess because of him, because of his past. He couldn't let her suffer any more because of him. He turned back to Victor. I'm not asking you again. Leave. Now. Victor's expression hardened, his jaw clenched. You'll regret this, he spat, his voice full of venom. This isn't over. Steele took a deep breath, his body coiling with tension, his mind focused. It is for you, Steele said, his voice as cold as steel itself. In that moment, everything seemed to freeze. There was a brief pause, as if time itself had held its breath. Then, without warning, Victor lunged toward Steele, his hand reaching for the knife at his belt. But Steele was faster. In one fluid motion, Steele grabbed Victor's wrist and twisted, disarming him with practiced precision. The knife clattered to the ground. Steele's fist connected with Victor's stomach, knocking the wind out of him, sending him crashing to the dirt. Steele stood over him, his chest heaving, his breath steady despite the violence of the confrontation. Victor groaned, struggling to get up. Steele didn't move. I warned you, Steele said, his voice unwavering. You should have listened. The fight was over. But Steele knew this was only the beginning. The group Victor was part of wasn't done yet. They would keep coming. And Steele would be ready. Steele stood over Victor, his chest rising and falling with each breath, his hand still gripping the man's wrist, keeping him pinned to the ground. Victor's breathing was ragged, and there was a look of shock in his eyes, mixed with rage. He tried to push himself up, but Steele's weight and strength kept him down. The girl, still standing behind Steele, watched in silence, her wide eyes filled with fear but also awe. Steele didn't take his eyes off Victor. You should have stayed away, Steele muttered under his breath, the words a quiet warning. Victor spat on the ground, his eyes burning with hatred. This isn't over, Steele, he snarled. You can't stop what's coming. Steele's grip tightened. You're wrong. It ends now. The tension in the air was thick, like a storm waiting to break. Steele's mind raced, his heart pounding in his chest, but there was a clarity to it now. He knew what he had to do. This wasn't just about surviving or protecting the girl anymore. This was about taking down the people who had been hiding in the shadows for too long. He wasn't going to let them drag anyone else into their mess. He stood up, releasing Victor's wrist, watching him crumble to the ground. Steele took a step back and pulled out his phone, dialing a number. The phone rang once before a voice answered on the other end. Steele, the voice said. It's done. Steele's voice was calm, but with an edge. Not yet. We have a bigger problem. The group I've been tracking, they're not backing down. They have more coming for us. The voice on the other end was quiet for a moment, then responded with urgency. We need to move fast. If you've got eyes on their location, we can take the fight to them. Steele's eyes flicked toward the girl. She was still standing there, looking at him with those wide, innocent eyes. He couldn't bring her any closer to this war. I'll make sure she's safe, Steele said, his voice firm. You just get the backup ready. He hung up and turned back to Victor, who was now trying to crawl to his feet. Steele wasn't in the mood for games anymore. He stepped toward him, and Victor froze, his eyes wide with realization. You don't have to do this, Victor pleaded, his voice cracking. It's not too late for you. Join us. We could rule this town together. Steele knelt down to Victor's level, his face a mask of cold indifference. You've got it all wrong, he said quietly. You think it's about power? It's about survival. And you're not going to survive. Steele reached down, grabbing Victor by the collar and lifting him off the ground. You've lost. Now go back to your people. Tell them to stay the hell out of my town. Victor's eyes were wide, filled with fear and confusion, but Steele wasn't giving him any more chances. With one last push, he shoved Victor away. The man staggered back, but before he could say another word, Steele turned his back on him. He walked over to the girl, who was now standing a little taller, her hands still clenched at her sides. Are you okay? He asked softly, his voice laced with concern. The girl nodded, though her eyes still betrayed her fear. I just wanted to stop, she whispered. Steele's expression softened, but he didn't speak for a moment. He wasn't sure what to say. He didn't have all the answers. I know, he said finally, his voice steady. I promise it will. I won't let anyone hurt you. He walked past her, heading for the door. His mind was already moving forward. There was no time to waste. He had to end this, once and for all. The night air felt colder as Steele stepped outside, the dark trees surrounding the cabin like silent sentinels. He could feel the weight of the fight ahead pressing on him, but there was no turning back. The girl's voice broke through his thoughts. What now? She asked, her voice small but brave. Steele paused, turning to face her. He could see the fear in her eyes, but he also saw something else, determination. She wasn't backing down, and neither was he. Now, Steele said, his voice filled with resolve, we finish this. We go after them, and we make sure they don't hurt anyone else. The girl nodded slowly, as if understanding the gravity of what he was saying. She was scared, but she wasn't backing down. And neither was he. Steele knew they were about to step into the fire. But there was no choice anymore. The past had caught up with him, and the only way out was to face it head-on. The sound of approaching motorcycles broke the stillness of the night. Steele's heart raced. He wasn't sure what they would face next, but he knew one thing for sure. This fight was just beginning, and they were going to finish it. Together, Steele stood at the edge of the cabin, the cold air biting at his skin. The sound of motorcycles was now unmistakable, growing louder with each passing second. The dark woods around them seemed to pulse with the tension of the approaching storm. The past hour had been a whirlwind. Victor's appearance, the girl's cryptic warning, and the sudden realization that everything Steele had tried to outrun was now charging straight for him. He felt it in his bones. The fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. Steele's eyes flicked to the girl, still standing behind him, her small frame tense with fear. He knew she was scared, but he also saw the courage burning in her eyes. She was tougher than anyone had given her credit for. She had been dragged into this nightmare because of him, but now, she was part of it, whether she liked it or not. She had a strength Steele could never ignore. He turned toward her. Stay close, he said, his voice firm. This isn't going to be easy. The girl nodded silently, her gaze fixed on Steele as she stepped forward, her footsteps quick but quiet. Steele could sense her unease, but she wasn't backing down. She trusted him, and in a way, that made this whole mess even heavier. They had no choice now but to face it head-on. The headlights finally appeared through the trees, the hum of the engines vibrating through the ground beneath them. Steele's fingers wrapped around the grip of his gun, his body tense, ready. His pulse quickened. There was no room for mistakes now. The bikers from the group were coming fast, and they were bringing the fight right to his doorstep. As the bikes came into view, Steele stepped forward, positioning himself between the girl and the oncoming threat. The bikes slowed as they neared, coming to a stop just a few feet away from the cabin. Steele's breath caught in his throat as he saw them. More of Victor's men. There were at least 5 of them, all wearing the same insignia, the same cold expressions, and the same sense of superiority. They knew Steele. They knew who he was, and that made them dangerous. One of the men, a tall figure with a gruff look, stepped off his bike and approached Steele. Steele, the man said, his voice rough, but with a mocking undertone. I didn't think you'd still be alive. Steele didn't flinch, his gaze unwavering. I'm not here for a reunion, he said, his tone cold and sharp. If you've come for the girl, you'll have to get through me first. The man chuckled, shaking his head. You think you can stop us? You're just one man. Steele's grip on his gun tightened. And I'm about to show you what one man can do. The man smirked, signaling to the others. Steele watched as they spread out, forming a loose circle around him and the girl. It was clear they weren't here to negotiate. They were here to take what they wanted. The girl, now standing a few steps behind Steele, looked at him with wide eyes, her fear palpable in the air. Steele glanced back at her, giving her a quick, reassuring look. Stay behind me, he said quietly. She nodded, though he could see the fear in her eyes. I won't let them get to you, he added. His voice calm but determined. The leader of the group stepped forward, his eyes locked onto Steele with cold intensity. You're wasting your time, he said, his voice low. The girl belongs to us now. You can't stop what's already been set in motion. Steele's pulse quickened, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He knew this wasn't just about a fight. This was bigger than that. These men had been hunting her, and now they were coming for him. He couldn't let them win. You're not taking her, Steele said firmly, his voice unwavering. I don't care who you work for. It ends here. The leader's smirk faded, replaced with an expression of annoyance. "You really think you can take all of us on?" he asked, his hand resting on the handle of a large knife at his side. Steele's eyes flicked to the other men, all of them armed, all of them waiting for a signal. He knew this wasn't just going to be a simple confrontation. It was going to be a war. The tension in the air was thick, every second stretching into eternity. Steele's hand tightened around his gun, his heart racing as he prepared for the inevitable. And then, just as the first man took a step toward him, the sound of sirens echoed in the distance. The bikers froze, glancing at each other in confusion. Steele didn't take his eyes off them, but the arrival of the police had thrown them off guard. For a brief moment, the balance shifted. "Looks like we're not alone," Steele said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. The leader sneered, clearly frustrated by the interruption. "This isn't over, Steele," he said through gritted teeth. "We'll be back. And next time, there won't be anyone to save you." Steele didn't respond. Instead, he turned to the girl, motioning for her to follow him. "Let's go," he said, his voice calm. "We need to get to safety." As they made their way quickly into the cabin, Steele kept a watchful eye on the bikers, who were now retreating, their bikes roaring to life as they disappeared into the night. Steele's heart pounded in his chest, but he didn't let the tension get to him. He had won this round, but the battle wasn't over. They would be back, and when they came, Steele would be ready. As he closed the cabin door behind him, he looked down at the girl, his gaze steady and unwavering. "We're not done yet," he said quietly. "But we will be." The girl looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and relief. "Thank you," she whispered. Steele nodded. "You're welcome. Now, let's make sure we finish what we started. For good." With that, Steele set his jaw, ready for whatever came next. The door to the cabin creaked as Steele closed it behind him, the faint sound of distant sirens still lingering in the air. He stood for a moment, listening, his eyes scanning the darkroom. The adrenaline from the confrontation was still coursing through his veins, but now it was mixed with something else, frustration. He knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. The group had retreated for now, but Steele could feel it. They would be back. And next time, it wouldn't be just a few bikers coming for him. This was bigger, much bigger. The girl stood by the small fireplace, her arms wrapped around herself, looking out into the night. Steele could tell she was trying to process everything, trying to make sense of the chaos that had come crashing into her life. He walked over to her, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. "You okay?" he asked, his voice softer than before. She didn't turn to look at him at first, but after a few seconds, she nodded. "I think so." Steele could hear the shakiness in her voice, and it made something tighten in his chest. She had been through so much in such a short time. He knew what it felt like to be thrown into a fight with no warning, no time to prepare. But she was tougher than most people gave her credit for. "You don't have to go through this alone," Steele said, his voice steady. Yet there was a sincerity to it that he hadn't shown to anyone in a long time. The girl looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mix of relief and fear. "I never wanted any of this," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. "I just wanted to be safe." Steele nodded slowly. "I know, but we don't always get what we want. Sometimes we have to fight for it." The girl's eyes flickered toward the window, where the faintest hint of light could be seen breaking through the trees. The night wasn't over. "What happens now?" she asked. Steele took a deep breath, his mind already turning, working out their next move. "We regroup. We plan. I'm going to make sure they never come back here. But it's going to take everything I've got." He looked out the window, his mind racing through the possibilities. The bikers had retreated for now, but Steele knew the group wasn't done with them. They wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted. The girl was caught in the middle of something far bigger than she realized, and Steele had no intention of letting her get hurt again. "I'll make sure you're safe," Steele said, his voice low but filled with conviction. "But we have to be smart. We have to strike first, or they'll keep coming." The girl's gaze flickered to the door, and then to Steele. She seemed to be thinking about something, processing his words. "I don't want to be a target anymore," she said, her voice cracking. Steele turned to face her fully, his expression unwavering. "You're not a target. You're a survivor, and I'm going to make sure it stays that way." He stood still for a moment, letting his words sink in. The silence in the room was heavy, but it wasn't uncomfortable. The girl had come a long way in a short amount of time, and now Steele had to help her see that she wasn't just some pawn in a dangerous game. She was stronger than that. "I need to get some things ready," Steele said, breaking the silence. He moved to the back of the cabin where his old duffel bag sat on the floor. "You should get some rest. I'll keep watch." The girl nodded again, this time with a sense of resignation. She had no choice but to trust him now. Steele began gathering his things, making sure everything was in order for the battle ahead. His old military gear was in the bag, the tools he would need to track down the group and finish this once and for all. He wasn't sure how much time they had, but he wasn't going to waste any more of it. The group was close. Steele could feel it. The girl's voice broke through his thoughts. "Are you sure this is the only way?" she asked, her voice full of doubt. Steele paused, looking over his shoulder at her. "What other way is there?" he asked quietly, his voice hardening slightly. "They're coming for us, and if we don't stop them, they'll hurt more people. We have to act first. It's the only way to end this." He knew the girl didn't want to hear that. She didn't want to think that there was no other way, that violence was the only answer. But Steele had seen too much, done too much, to think any differently. He wasn't the same man who had walked away from the club all those years ago. That man was gone. The man who stood before her now was a protector, someone who would do anything to keep the girl safe. He finished packing his gear, zipping up the bag and slinging it over his shoulder. "Get some sleep," he said, his tone softer now. "We've got a long day ahead of us." The girl hesitated, but then nodded, her face drawn with exhaustion. She walked over to the small cot in the corner and sat down, wrapping herself in a thin blanket. Steele turned back to the door, his mind still focused on the fight to come. There was no way to predict what the next day would bring, but Steele knew this. The fight was far from over, and he wasn't backing down. He had to protect the girl, protect anyone who was at risk. And no matter what happened, he was going to make sure that the people responsible for all this pain would pay. The sound of the night outside grew quieter as Steele stood there, his mind racing, the weight of his promise heavy on his shoulders. Tomorrow, they would face whatever came for them, and Steele would be ready. The morning broke over the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. Steele stood at the window, his gaze fixed on the woods surrounding the cabin. The silence was suffocating, but it wasn't peaceful. His mind was racing, running through the possibilities of what lay ahead. The confrontation was inevitable. He could feel it in his bones. His hand rested on the gun at his side, the weight of it both a comfort and a reminder of how far this had gone. The girl, now awake, sat on the cot in the corner, her eyes fixed on Steele. She hadn't spoken much since the events of the previous night, but he could see the question in her eyes. What now? Steele didn't have the answer. Not exactly, but he knew one thing for sure. This couldn't drag on any longer. The group wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted, and he wasn't about to let them tear apart what was left of his life. He walked over to the table, where a map of the surrounding area was spread out. His fingers traced the routes he had taken in the past, the roads that led out of town, and the ones he knew were connected to the people hunting them. He had a plan, but it wasn't perfect. It never was. But it was the best chance they had. Steele could feel the girl watching him, her presence a constant reminder of the stakes. He had made promises to protect her, to make sure she was safe. And he wasn't about to break them. The door creaked open, and Big Mike stepped inside, his heavy boots making the floorboards groan under his weight. His eyes flicked around the cabin before landing on Steele. "We're ready," Big Mike said, his voice gravelly. "The boys are in position. We're going to hit them hard." Steele nodded. "It's time." Big Mike's eyes softened for a moment, a flicker of understanding passing between them. They had fought side by side for years, and he knew what this meant to Steele. "We'll end it today," Big Mike said, his voice filled with conviction. "We'll make sure they never come back." Steele turned back to the map, his mind already racing through the plan. They would take the fight to the group, strike them where they least expected it. They had to take down their operations, disrupt their network, and make sure they didn't get another chance to hurt anyone. "Let's go," Steele said, his voice firm, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. "We move now." The girl, who had been sitting quietly, stood up, her face pale but determined. She walked over to Steele, her eyes steady as she looked up at him. "I'm coming with you," she said quietly. Steele's first instinct was to tell her to stay back, to keep her safe. But he saw the resolve in her eyes. She wasn't afraid anymore. She had been through too much to sit back now. Steele didn't argue. Instead, he nodded, acknowledging her bravery. "Stay close," he said, his voice low but steady. They couldn't afford to lose focus. Together, they made their way out of the cabin, the cool morning air greeting them as they stepped into the open. The sounds of the forest seemed muted, like the world itself was holding its breath. Steele's motorcycle was parked a few feet away, ready for the ride. Big Mike's bike was already roaring to life, the rest of the brothers waiting just outside. Steele swung onto his bike, the engine coming to life with a familiar growl. The girl hesitated for a moment before climbing onto the back, wrapping her arms around Steele's waist. He could feel her tense, but she didn't pull away. She was ready. Steele revved the engine, and they took off, the sound of the bikes echoing through the quiet woods. The town was just a few miles away, but it felt like a lifetime as they made their way toward the heart of the enemy's territory. The sun was rising higher now, casting long shadows on the roads as Steele led the way. The landscape blurred by as they sped through the quiet streets, the adrenaline coursing through his veins. Every corner, every turn was another step closer to the final showdown. The plan was set. They would strike fast, hard, and without mercy. They would disrupt the group's operations and take back control. Steele's grip tightened on the handlebars, his focus sharp. This wasn't just about revenge, it was about ending the cycle. He couldn't let them hurt anyone else. The girl needed to see a world where she didn't have to live in fear. And Steele needed to make sure that this was the last time anyone would come after her. As they neared the town, Steele's heart rate picked up. This was it. The moment of truth. The group was close, but they wouldn't know what hit them. Steele's eyes flicked over to Big Mike, who nodded once, signaling that they were in position. Steele gave one last glance at the girl behind him, her face resolute, and then he sped forward. The others followed, a wave of bikes cutting through the streets. They were unstoppable. The group had underestimated them. And now, Steele was going to make sure they paid the price. The town was their battleground now, and Steele wouldn't rest until the threat was gone. It was time to take back control. It was time to end this for good.